2004. He was, at this time, famous for having been involved in the first brawl on the floor of the Congress. He was known as the spitting lion because he spit in the face of another congressman. But what Matthew Lyons did is, in a Vermont newspaper, he published a letter criticizing John Adams for wanting a continuing grasp for power and a thirst for ridiculous pomp. He further went on to state that he suggested the president be sent to a madhouse. And in something I think many of us can probably identify with President Adams is that he was a middle-aged man with an expanding girth. Matthew Lyons concluded his letter by referring to the president as his rotundity. Well, a federal grand jury he was arrested and promptly indicted by a federal grand jury, and in October of that year, 1798, he went to trial. Matthew Lyons represented himself, and his defense was, among other things, that it was what he was saying was truthful, but also that it was completely allowable because of the First Amendment. The court didn't even consider that, because at the time, remember this was 1798, at the time the courts did not have the idea that they could in fact look at the constitutionality of the laws. That didn't happen until 1803 in the case of Marbury versus Madison. So at the time, the courts thought that the only thing they could do was determine whether or not the evidence was there, if the law had been violated. It didn't help when Matthew Lyons accused the judge of having dinner with the president. But in any event, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 4 months in jail and pay a $1,000 fine, which is something in the range of about $15,000 today. He was one of the first. Over the next couple of years, 20 other people were prosecuted. 10 of those were sent to jail. Most of the people prosecuted were newspaper editors for their writings, the anti-federalist statements. One was a drunk that was wandering around Philadelphia saying rude things about the president. He got a $150 fine. And so this was the attack on the First Amendment within 7 years of when it had first been adopted by the United States. The impossible thing that we have to wrap our brains around with this is this was the same generation that had written and enacted the First Amendment. In many cases, these were the very same politicians, people in Congress that had enacted this law. And yet, they felt it was fine to go ahead and pass these laws. So how did it all end? Well, the courts didn't intervene because, as I said, they didn't feel that they had the authority. So it led Thomas Jefferson and James Madison of Virginia felt very strongly about this. So what they did is they went to the states of Virginia and Kentucky and drafted something called the Virginia and the Kentucky Resolutions, which basically said that when the federal government has a law that is unconstitutional, that the states have the right to stand up to the federal government and refuse to enforce it and protect their people. And the issue became, it was a big one for states' rights. And of course, in following through with the law of unintended consequences, it became a major arguing point for the southern states when they argued that they had the right to secede in 1860. But in any event, it became a major issue. It was all through then the United States, and in 1800 you had an election for president. The way that it ended up being resolved is that the Federalists were swept from power. Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans took control. The law, as it was written by the Federalists, actually had an expiration date on it, and it was due to expire the day before Jefferson became president. They went to pains to not re-up the law because they were afraid that Jefferson would actually use it against them. But as soon as Jefferson became president, he pardoned all the people that had been convicted by the law and returned all of their fines. In another odd twist to the Sedition Act, the Of course, but since it had expired, it never came before the Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court never had a chance to rule on it. But it was, in fact, declared unconstitutional in 1964. At that point, in the Supreme Court, in the case of New York Times versus Sullivan, went back and addressed the Sedition Act and specifically declared it unconstitutional 165 years after it had been issued. So what's the moral of the story? Well, I think that the main thing that we could take from this is that the First Amendment is strong. It survives. It had probably its most severe challenge right out of the chute. And yet, enough of the country was united at that time, as I'm sure we are today, to protect those freedoms. Those freedoms, they're held dear by all Americans, regardless of political persuasion. If I may quote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1919 wrote, "The ultimate good desired is best reached by the free speech and free trade in ideas. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. Our Constitution and the freedoms guaranteed therein is an experiment, as all life is an experiment." Thank you.
Just a couple of things I neglected to mention at the beginning. Blue Mountain School has set up a table outside in the lobby and they've moved inside now. They're right there in the back, waving us down. They have baked goods and information about their school. It's a fundraiser for the schools. And also, outside we have water and coffee for anyone about that. Today's program, we're trying to keep it to just around 2 hours, so we should be done by about 4 o'clock. So we're going to try to keep things on track and keep moving along. Our next presenter is going to be Professor Bill Kovar. He is a professional journalist and a professor of journalism at Radford University. So he is going to do a presentation on the freedom of the press for us.
Thank you. So much. Thanks for inviting us. Thank you, everybody. So good to see you here today. Wasn't that a great history lesson? I really have to get you to come to my media history class sometime. Thank you so much. Are there any journalists here? Because I want to recognize people who make their living with the First Amendment every day. Everybody knows Doug Thompson. Yay, Doug. All right. And I'm sorry, in the back. From WBTF. Yay. Who did I miss? Are there other journalists here? Are there other journalists here? How about other people who make their living with the First Amendment every day? Librarians? Is there? I saw Anne a little while ago. Anybody else work as a librarian who makes their living as teachers? Could you guys stand up? Okay, so ministers, people who make their living with religion and First Amendment issues. Could you stand up? Are they here? Are there teachers here? Would the teachers stand up, please? Stand up, stand up. Thank you. Are there activists? There's Mara. I thought I saw Mara. Yes, activists. Are there public servants here? People who protect us and keep these freedoms going strong. Thank you very much. People who make sure that our Constitution is protected. We love you. All right, so I love you guys too. Thank you very much. I have a confession. I am an enemy of the people. And I'm really so sorry about this. I didn't mean to be. Mr. Trump said I am, and of course, nevertheless, I work in the tradition of Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Pulitzer, Ernie Pyle, and Woodward and Bernstein. Nevertheless, I continue to cover your kids' football and soccer and basketball games. And I thought specifically of Doug when I wrote that, actually. And nevertheless, I persist in writing about your political candidates and whether or not they live up to their campaign promises. And I stay up late with your board of supervisors because they're working on your budget and they work late into the evening, and I want to make sure that I get it right, when they tell you what the new budget is going to be. In fact, I respect public servants. I consider myself to be a public servant as well. Sometimes I go into the line of fire, if only to bring the honor of what our soldiers are doing back into your living rooms or onto the front pages of your newspapers and websites. I respect soldiers, if only because sometimes journalists like Ernie Pyle and Robert Capa share their fate. In fact, there's a monument to journalists killed in the line of duty on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. There are about 2,300 names there right now. Many friends and colleagues are counted there, and I am proud of them and proud of our tradition of upholding freedom of speech and the press, even in the face of the worst threats. It's true, sometimes we write things that are overly critical of the candidates, or the board of supervisors, or the politicians who send kids off to war, and that's necessary, and hopefully the criticism contributes to the public interest. And it's true, sometimes we write snarky things about celebrities. So we're not perfect, that's the bottom line here. The press is not perfect, and we don't want you to love us, we want you to understand us. Just as we would not be attack dogs, so too do we not want to be lapdogs, okay? We're supposed to be watchdogs. That's the role of the press. Woof, woof. You know, that's us. People tend to be very skeptical of the media, and actually I think that's a really good thing. We welcome the skepticism, and right now being passed around is a yardstick for you to measure that skepticism. It's the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists. And on the back, you know, is another yardstick, which is the Hutchins Commission report on, you know, what should the press be doing. Those are our yardsticks. Let us know if we're not measuring up. That's okay. Call the editor of the Floyd Press. Call Doug's editor and say, Doug, you messed up again this time. But I don't think that'll happen too often. But when it does, you know, we want to hear about it. Our Code of Ethics demands that we be accountable and responsive. You will see that in the Code of Ethics, okay? So we are supposed to be minimizing harm. We are supposed to care about people. We are supposed to put the public interest ahead of personal interests. And I would also be glad if you would invite me or any other member of the Society of Professional Journalists. John Hopkins, who's not here today, is also an SPJ member, and there's other SPJ members, you know, here in Floyd County. We will come to any club or classroom or public hearing and talk about the role of the press. We will talk with you about what the role of the press should be in the digital age. We welcome a reasonable dialogue. We are not afraid of criticism. We are not wallflowers, as it turns out. You know, we will be happy to talk with any group that wants to have a dialogue about the press, about freedom of the press, and how could the press do a better job. That's what we do. Nevertheless, according to our president, we are enemies of the people. And it's a sad day on Pennsylvania Avenue when hate speech and bully rhetoric can be turned against the very First Amendment that allows open discussion of the great issues of the day. There is a danger here, and it's chilling. It's a chilling danger. We all know that violent talk can lead to violent action. We've seen this in history. We saw a sharp increase in lynchings and racial violence. Racial violence. We saw a sharp increase in lynchings and racial violence when the KKK film Birth of a Nation was released in 1915. We knew there could never have been German concentration camps in the 1930s and 40s if it wasn't for films like The Eternal Jew or newspapers like Der Stürmer. Okay? We understand that there could never have been genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994 if it weren't for Kangura newspaper or Radio Rwanda. Okay? So this enemy's talk from the White House is, in my opinion, a dangerous form of hate speech, and we don't know where it will lead. So I guess I take it a little personally, even though it's not aimed just at me or even one small group of people who are struggling to keep the presses rolling in America. It's really aimed at the First Amendment, and it's your First Amendment. It is aimed at the very First Amendment that lets you choose your house of worship, that lets you speak freely in public meetings, that lets you start your own newspaper or website if you don't like the ones that are already serving your community. Okay? So I'm not an enemy of the people, really. More accurately, I'm an opponent of the people who want to restrict freedom of speech and who want to shut down websites and press rooms and broadcast studios. But more importantly, I am very definitely an enemy of the